The Genesis project begins. The research lab was cold, silent, and intensely focused, its sleek walls glowing with a soft, bluish light. Dr. Eva Lark stood at the center of the vast laboratory, her silver eyes locked on the holographic projection floating before her. Strings of DNA sequences pulsed and twisted in midair, bathed in soft bioluminescent light. The holograms were only part of the work underway in the Aean Research Institute, a hidden facility deep within the sterile, mineral-rich core of Aean, a once thriving planet on the edge of known space. Now, it stood as the last bastion of hope for the Aean species, whose very survival hung in the balance. The threat of extinction was imminent. The Aean species, technologically advanced and intellectually superior, had been the dominant force in their corner of the galaxy for millennia. But their enemies, the Void Hunters, were relentless. These predatory creatures from the dark edges of the universe had decimated Aean outposts, leaving only devastation in their wake. The traditional Aean warriors, despite their advanced training and superior technology, simply could not match the raw physical resilience and brutality of the Void Hunters. The Aean military was formidable, but it was quickly becoming clear that it was no match for the savage ferocity of their enemies. This realization sent the Aean leaders scrambling for a solution, and after many failed experiments, a final desperate plan began to take shape. They would combine their genetic traits with the physical strengths of another species, one that had proven its resilience on a massive scale: humans. The thought itself was radical, almost sacrilegious. The idea of merging their genetic material with that of humans went against everything the Aean people had known. They had always prided themselves on their purity and technological superiority, but survival was the ultimate priority. This was a necessity, not a choice. Dr. Lark was the brilliant mind behind the project, known only as Project Genesis. The initiative, still in its early phases, was designed to merge human and Aean genetic material in hopes of creating a new breed of warrior, super soldiers capable of withstanding the Void Hunters' devastating onslaught. It was a concept that seemed to defy all boundaries of ethics, yet for the survival of her people, Dr. Lark found herself committed to it. She had long since separated herself from the moral implications of the project, focusing only on the science. The data she was analyzing now was unprecedented. As her fingers danced through the holographic display, adjusting the sequence markers and evaluating the genetic compatibility, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. The latest tests revealed that the human genetic samples, specifically the DNA of one human male, showed an extraordinary compatibility with Aean genes. It was something that Dr. Lark had not predicted, not even in her wildest hypotheses. Human genetics, with their inherent adaptability and surprising resilience, had exceeded every expectation by far. The mutation found in this particular human, Thomas Lance, was exactly what the Aean scientists had been searching for. It was the perfect combination of physical strength and rapid cellular regeneration. This man could be the key to saving their species. As the data swirled around her, she muttered softly to herself, barely able to contain the excitement in her voice. The human adaptability factor exceeds our most optimistic projections. This could work. It must work. Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Lark's posture straightened instinctively as the tall figure of Director Cal Nix entered the lab. His dark, piercing eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, the two exchanged a wordless communication. He knew as well as she did that the success or failure of Project Genesis would mean the difference between the future of the Aean people or their ultimate demise. "Is it ready, Dr. Lark?" Director Nix asked, his voice calm but with an undertone of concern. "Have you confirmed the results?" Dr. Lark turned away from the display and looked him in the eyes. "Yes, Director," she replied, her voice steady, but laced with a note of urgency. "This human, Thomas Lance, his genetic makeup is perfect for our needs. His physical traits, his regenerative abilities, they far exceed anything we anticipated. If we combine his genetics with ours, we could create warriors strong enough to face the Void Hunters. Director Nix nodded slowly, taking in the data. And the human? Is he aware of what we intend to do? Dr. Lark hesitated before answering, her mind racing. The moral questions were something she had pushed aside for the sake of the mission. But now, with the human subject about to arrive, those questions began to surface. He knows. He agreed to participate, although I'm not sure he fully understands what this will entail. But in the end, it's a matter of survival. Good, Nick said. We cannot afford to hesitate. The Void Hunters are closing in, and if we do not act quickly, we will lose everything. Dr. Lark nodded in agreement. She couldn't afford to be distracted by doubt. This was the only chance they had. The laboratory doors slid open with a soft hiss, and in stepped the man who would become the cornerstone of the Genesis project. Tom Lance was not what Dr. Lark had expected. He wasn't an ordinary soldier. He was a living testament to human physicality and resilience. Standing tall with a chiseled, muscular frame, he exuded confidence and intelligence. His light brown hair was neatly combed, though his piercing blue eyes revealed a hint of curiosity as they scanned the high-tech laboratory. His simple medical gown hung loosely over his broad shoulders, barely concealing the strength beneath. He had the look of a man who had seen war, someone hardened by battle, yet there was something else about him. Something that Dr. Lark couldn't immediately place. "Welcome to Project Genesis, Mr. Lance," Dr. Lark said, her voice steady, but with a subtle edge of nerves. "I am Dr. Eva Lark, and I will be overseeing your participation in this initiative." Tom gave a slight smile, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than necessary. "Please, call me Tom," he said with a charming ease. "And I have to say, this place is impressive. Not quite as impressive as the view, though." For a brief moment, Dr. Lark felt a flush creeping into her cheeks, but she quickly composed herself. She had no time for distractions, not now. Not with everything on the line. "You understand the purpose of your involvement here, don't you?" Dr. Lark continued, her voice regaining its professionalism as she accessed his genetic data on the holographic display. "Your DNA contains a rare mutation that makes you uniquely compatible with our species. We believe that by merging your human genetics with the Aean genome, we can create super soldiers capable of standing against the Void Hunters." Tom stepped forward, studying the data on the screen with interest. "So you mean a breeding program?" he asked bluntly. "You're using my DNA to create soldiers." Dr. Lark took a deep breath, resisting the urge to shy away from the directness of his words. "Yes," she replied, her voice firm. "But we prefer to call it genetic harmonization. Your human genetic adaptability is unparalleled, and with your cooperation, we believe we can save both our species." Tom's gaze softened for a moment, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. "And what exactly will I be doing in this program?" Before Dr. Lark could answer, Director Nix stepped in, his voice a calm presence that helped to steady the tension. "Dr. Lark will be overseeing your involvement in the trials. This will be a partnership, Mr. Lance. We need your cooperation to ensure the success of this project." Tom nodded slowly, his gaze shifting back to Dr. Lark. "Well then," he said with a wry grin, "let's get started. I'm here to help save your species." As the doors to the lab closed behind them, Dr. Lark couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge was only just beginning. She had thought she understood the science, the technology, and the mission, but she hadn't counted on the complexities of human emotions and the powerful, undeniable chemistry that was beginning to develop between her and the man who might be the key to her people's survival. Unraveling potential. The following days at the Aean Research Institute were a blur of tests, genetic analysis, and experiments. Dr. Eva Lark, despite her professional demeanor, found herself increasingly distracted by the presence of Tom Lance. The human soldier, now designated as the primary genetic candidate for the Aeans Project Genesis, was unlike anyone Dr. Lark had ever encountered. His physical capabilities surpassed even her initial expectations, and as their work together continued, the relationship between them became more complex. What started as a purely scientific partnership began to shift in ways she couldn't fully control. As the project moved forward, Tom's presence in the lab became a constant. His genetic tests were regularly updated, and the results continued to astonish Dr. Lark and the entire team. His physical resilience was beyond anything the Aean had encountered, even in their own elite soldiers. He had the stamina of 1,000 Aean warriors and the ability to regenerate his cells at a rate that outstripped the most advanced Aean biotechnologies. The strain of each test seemed to barely affect him, a fact that was both thrilling and unsettling for Dr. Lark. The human genome, when combined with Aean genes, was showing the promise of creating warriors capable of standing against the Void Hunters. The first week of tests had been grueling, and Dr. Lark couldn't deny that she had been consumed by her research. But the constant proximity to Tom Lance, his smile, his natural charisma, and his unrelenting curiosity had begun to chip away at her concentration. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the impersonal, clinical detachment that she'd always prided herself on. In one of the larger testing chambers, Dr. Lark observed as Tom underwent another round of endurance tests. The room was equipped with several biometric sensors, each carefully calibrated to measure every aspect of his physical performance. A series of holographic projections flickered around him, displaying real-time data of his body's responses. His pulse, heart rate, blood oxygen levels, all of it was being monitored. And yet, as Tom sprinted on the treadmill, lifting weights, and undergoing a series of complex movements designed to test his limits, Dr. Lark couldn't ignore the fact that he was barely breaking a sweat. "You're pushing the limits of human biology, Tom," Dr. Lark said, her voice steady but with an edge of fascination. "Your cellular regeneration rate has now surpassed 400% of what we originally predicted. It's beyond extraordinary." Tom stopped for a moment, catching his breath. He wiped the sweat from his brow and turned toward her, flashing a confident grin. "I've always been good at pushing limits, Doc. But I have to say, your species has some amazing upgrades too. You've got these glowing markings all over you that I can't quite figure out." His gaze lingered on her glowing bioluminescence, and Dr. Lark felt a warm flush spread across her skin. "They're an indication of my emotional state, among other things," she replied quickly, hoping to steer the conversation back to science. "Aean bioluminescence is tied to our nervous system and has long been used for communication and status. It's not always ideal for privacy." She couldn't help but notice how his eyes followed the pulse of her glowing markings as she spoke. The flickering of the lights matched the increasing erratic rhythm of her heartbeat, and she couldn't tell if it was due to his proximity or her growing attraction to him. She needed to focus. There was far too much at stake to let distractions get in the way. Tom smirked, as though he could sense her discomfort, and went back to his exercises. He didn't push the topic further, but the spark of something unspoken between them lingered in the air. The tests continued for several more days, each one more intense than the last. Tom's capabilities kept surprising Dr. Lark, and as his physical limits were pushed, new data poured in, revealing an unprecedented level of compatibility between his human genetics and the Aean DNA. Their cells were harmonizing at an unimaginable rate. This was it, the breakthrough they had been waiting for. By the end of the week, it was clear that Tom Lance was more than just a test subject. His body had become the foundation for the next generation of warriors. The merging of human and Aean DNA was no longer just theoretical. It was happening in real time. The potential for success had skyrocketed. One afternoon, as the lab lights dimmed, signaling the end of another testing session, Dr. Lark found herself alone with Tom in one of the observation rooms. The entire lab was quiet, with only the low hum of machines keeping the silence at bay. She had just completed the latest round of analysis, and the numbers were astonishing. Tom's biological harmony with Aean genetics was beyond anything they had ever hoped for. "How do you feel?" Dr. Lark asked as she glanced over the results. She was still deep in thought about the next phase of the project, but she couldn't ignore the man standing in front of her. Tom leaned against the glass wall, his gaze thoughtful. "I feel good. Stronger than ever, actually. It's like my body's working on a level I didn't even know was possible." Dr. Lark nodded, but her attention was clearly on the data in front of her. "The harmonization is almost perfect. Your physical resilience is off the charts, and your cellular regeneration rate is still accelerating at an exponential rate." Tom pushed off the wall and walked closer to her, his broad shoulders filling the space. "But you haven't told me yet. What exactly does this mean for the future? For your people?" The weight of his question pulled Dr. Lark's focus entirely to him. Her silver eyes met his, and for a moment, the clinical distance she had maintained throughout the project seemed to vanish. "It means we have a chance," she said softly, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. "We can finally fight back. We can build an army of warriors, soldiers who can withstand the Void Hunters and protect the Aean race." Tom stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming in the small room. "And what about the rest of the plan?" he asked, his voice quiet but intense. "You've told me about creating super soldiers, but there's more to this, isn't there? You haven't said everything." Dr. Lark hesitated, her mind racing. She had been so focused on the success of the project that she hadn't fully considered the implications of its final stages. This was no longer just about creating warriors. It was about creating life itself. The next phase of the project would involve combining their genetic material in a way that would lead to the birth of the first generation of hybrid soldiers. It was something she had never fully explained to Tom. "Wait," she began, but before she could finish, Tom gently placed a hand on her arm, his eyes locking with hers. "You don't have to explain everything to me, Doc," he said softly. "But I need to know that you're in this with me, that we're in this together." For the first time, Dr. Lark felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. She swallowed hard, her bioluminescence flaring slightly, betraying the unease she felt. "I'm committed to this, Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have to be. It's the only way to save us." For a brief, electrifying moment, the space between them felt charged with something deeper, something that wasn't just scientific curiosity, but something more complex. The air was thick with tension as they stood there, close yet separated by the weight of their respective roles. And as Dr. Lark looked into Tom's eyes, she realized that for better or worse, the Genesis project was no longer just about saving her people. It was about the bond forming between them, and the power it could have to change everything. The trial of bonds. The first rays of artificial daylight filtered through the reinforced glass panels of the Aean Research Institute, casting soft shadows over the sterile surfaces of the lab. The hum of machinery filled the air, but despite the usual cacophony of technological activity, Dr. Eva Lark was silent. The weight of the project now lay squarely on her shoulders, and with each passing day, the complexity of her emotions grew more tangled. She had come to understand one thing. Project Genesis was no longer just a scientific endeavor. It had become a deeply personal journey for her, one that she had never anticipated when she had first taken on the role of overseeing human Aean genetic fusion. Dr. Lark stood in front of a terminal, reviewing the most recent results of Tom Lance's trials. His physical abilities continued to surpass even the most optimistic predictions. Each test was a success, each marker surpassed, and yet, the deeper Dr. Lark delved into the data, the more she realized the enormity of what they were undertaking. The harmony between Tom's human DNA and the Aean genome had reached a level that could only be described as revolutionary. But there was something else, something she hadn't predicted. Tom Lance's human nature, the very thing that had made him so adaptable, had begun to affect her more deeply than she could explain. His laughter, his steady presence, the way his eyes held a mix of humor and understanding. It was impossible not to feel drawn to him. For the first time since the project had begun, Dr. Lark found herself questioning the personal cost of their scientific triumph. In the adjoining room, Tom stood in front of a mirror, examining his reflection. The tests were more intense now, requiring him to engage in physical feats that pushed him to his limits. His muscles were taut, his body lean, and despite the demanding trials, he had never felt better. It wasn't just his physical strength that had grown, it was something deeper. He could feel it, like an undercurrent beneath his skin, an energy that seemed to flow through him at the cellular level. He ran his hand over his jaw, thinking back to his earlier conversation with Dr. Lark. There was something between them, something electric, but neither of them had spoken of it directly. Tom had noticed it in the way her eyes lingered on him, in the way her bioluminescent markings flickered and changed in intensity when they interacted. He could feel the tension rising between them, and despite his natural reserve, he found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't fully understand. He had to admit, he admired her intellect and her dedication to the project. But there was more to it than that. There was an undeniable pull between them that couldn't be ignored. What was supposed to be a professional partnership was evolving into something that neither of them had planned for. The door to the lab slid open, and Dr. Lark entered, her silver eyes fixed on the data pad she was carrying. Tom turned as she stepped into the room, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Words weren't necessary. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. "How's the regeneration rate today?" Dr. Lark asked, breaking the silence. She didn't look up from the data pad as she spoke, but her tone held an edge of something more than professional concern. "It's off the charts," Tom replied, his voice light, but with an underlying tension. "I've never felt anything like it." Dr. Lark nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. She had spent the entire night analyzing the data, her mind consumed by the implications of their work. The tests were showing remarkable results. Tom's cells were regenerating at a rate so fast that it was almost as though his body was evolving in real time. But more than that, it was the emotional connection between them that had started to disrupt her focus. "Your ability to heal is almost superhuman," Dr. Lark continued, trying to refocus on the science. "But we need to take the next step in the trials." Tom didn't respond immediately, his gaze following the way Dr. Lark's bioluminescent markings shifted subtly with her every movement. It was mesmerizing, and he found it difficult to ignore the attraction that had been growing between them. He had come to understand that she wasn't just a brilliant scientist. She was someone who, despite her detachment, had her own vulnerabilities. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice tinged with something that was more than mere curiosity. Dr. Lark looked up at him then, her silver eyes locking with his. For a fleeting moment, the world around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them standing there in the silence of the lab. She could feel her pulse quicken, the connection between them palpable in the air. She quickly averted her gaze, pushing the feeling away. "We'll begin integrating your DNA into the hybrid test samples," she said, her voice more professional now, but still tinged with something unspoken. "It's the next logical step. We need to see how the combined genes will react when applied to an actual hybrid creation." Tom's brow furrowed. "Hybrid creation?" "Yes," Dr. Lark explained. "We'll be creating the first generation of Aean human hybrids. These will be the next stage in the Genesis project, capable of breeding an entirely new line of soldiers, strong enough to fight the Void Hunters. The success of your trials depends on it." Tom thought about the enormity of what she was saying. They were about to make history, creating a new race of super soldiers from the DNA of two species, a hybrid born from the merging of human and Aean genes. He knew the stakes were high, but the more time he spent with Dr. Lark, the more it felt like something much bigger than just saving a species. It felt like the beginning of something transformative. "And what about us?" Tom asked, his voice low but filled with meaning. Dr. Lark felt a jolt run through her, as though the ground beneath her shifted. "What do you mean?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. "You know exactly what I mean," Tom said, stepping closer to her. The space between them seemed to shrink, and the air grew thick with anticipation. "This thing between us, it's not just professional anymore." Dr. Lark's heart raced, her bioluminescence pulsing more rapidly as she stepped back, struggling to keep her composure. "This is about the mission," she said quickly, her voice strained. "We can't afford distractions. This project is too important. My people depend on it." Tom looked at her with quiet intensity. "And what about you, Dr. Lark? What do you need?" For a long moment, they stood there, each locked in the gaze of the other. There was no denying the connection between them. Neither could pretend that the pull they felt wasn't real. But in that moment, Dr. Lark couldn't let herself give in. She had to keep her focus on the mission. It was all that mattered. "We'll proceed with the next phase of the trial," she said, her voice firm, though her emotions were still a storm beneath the surface. "The hybrids will be created, and we'll see if they can truly be the warriors we need." Tom didn't speak. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable as he stepped away from her. Dr. Lark watched him, unable to fully shake the feelings stirring within her. She had to suppress it all. The attraction, the growing bond, the uncertainty, because if she didn't, everything she had worked for would be lost. The survival of her people depended on her being able to stay focused. But as she turned back to the data screen, her thoughts kept circling back to Tom, and for the first time since starting this project, she wondered if she could truly separate the science from the personal.